Carthage, perched on the coast of North Africa, breathed ambition with every gust of sea wind. It was not merely a city, it was an empire of commerce, of ships and silver, of incense and defiance. Yet despite its reach across the Mediterranean, there was one rival it could not suppress: Rome. In the wake of the First Punic War, Carthage had been humbled. Rome had emerged victorious, seizing Sicily, imposing crushing tributes, and forcing a maritime power to taste bitter defeat on the very sea it once ruled. In the shadow of that humiliation, in 247 BCE, a child was born into the prominent Barca family. His name was Hannibal. His father, Hamilcar Barca, was not merely a general, he was a man forged in war, with eyes that held the unextinguished fire of vengeance. Rome had not just beaten Carthage, it had insulted it. And Hamilcar was determined that his son would inherit not only his name, but his hatred. From an early age, Hannibal was unlike the other children of Carthage. While others played by the harbor or studied trade, Hannibal was trained in the arts of war. He learned the sword before he learned the lyre. He memorized topography while others recited poetry. And above all, he listened deeply, silently, to the stories his father told. Stories of betrayal, of lost battles, of Roman arrogance and Punic shame. Then came the moment that would define the boy forever. At the age of 9, Hannibal was led by his father to a sacred altar dedicated to the god Baal-Hamon. Beneath a stone canopy, amidst flickering firelight and the scent of blood and oil, Hamilcar made his son swear a solemn oath that he would never be a friend to Rome. The vow was not symbolic, it was destiny. It carved itself into the marrow of Hannibal's bones, into the rhythm of his breath. From that day on, he would not simply live. He would prepare. Soon after, Hannibal accompanied Hamilcar across the sea to Hispania. There, far from the heart of Carthage, Hamilcar sought to build a new base of power, a platform from which Carthage might one day rise again. Hannibal watched his father conquer, negotiate, and construct a web of alliances among the Iberian tribes. Every battle was a lesson. Every victory a step closer to revenge. The land was brutal, wild, and rich in iron and ambition. Hannibal adapted quickly. He rode with the cavalry, marched with the infantry, and earned the respect of veteran soldiers before he reached manhood. His brothers, Hasdrubal and Mago, joined him in learning the family craft of war, but it was Hannibal who burned with something deeper, a calling, not a career. Then, in 229 BCE, tragedy struck. Hamilcar was killed in battle while crossing a river during a campaign in eastern Iberia. The general who had once seemed immortal was gone. Hannibal, just 18, stood on foreign soil not as a boy protected by legacy, but as a man bound by duty. Though Hasdrubal the Fair, Hamilcar's son-in-law, assumed command, everyone knew where true promise lay. For the next 8 years, Hannibal continued to rise. He served as a commander under Hasdrubal, sharpening his skills and learning the delicate balance of power between diplomacy and domination. He studied the cultures of Iberia, mastering their languages, customs, and ambitions. He understood that to build an army, one must first win allegiance not by force alone, but by loyalty, gold, and vision. When Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BCE, the army did not hesitate. They chose Hannibal as their new general. He was only 26. The Carthaginian Senate hesitated, but in Hispania, the soldiers had already declared him leader. They didn't care about age. They followed ability, and Hannibal had proven he possessed it in abundance. From that moment, Hannibal moved with singular purpose. He extended Carthaginian control across more of Iberia, capturing cities, fortifying positions, and preparing for the inevitable. He knew that a second war with Rome would come. He would not wait for it. He would summon it. His gaze fixed on Saguntum, a wealthy Iberian city allied with Rome. Though technically beyond the agreed line of Carthaginian influence, the diplomatic status was vague. Rome issued warnings. Hannibal ignored them. He laid siege to Saguntum for 8 relentless months. When the city finally fell, its citizens were slaughtered or sold into slavery. Rome was enraged. To them, this was an act of aggression. But Hannibal had calculated every move. He knew what would follow. He welcomed it. Back in Carthage, the Senate squabbled. War would mean economic ruin. But in Iberia, Hannibal had already set events in motion. He did not ask for approval. He did not need it. The time had come to do the unthinkable. In the autumn of 218 BCE, Hannibal assembled an army unlike any the ancient world had ever seen. Tens of thousands of infantry, cavalry, and war elephants were marshaled not to defend Hispania, but to strike directly into the heart of Italy. The route was perilous, winding north through Gaul, across the Rhone, and finally over the snowbound, treacherous peaks of the Alps. It was madness. No army had ever attempted it. But Hannibal had not forgotten the oath he made as a child. He had not buried the legacy of his father. He would not wait for Rome to dictate the terms of the next war. Instead, he would bring the war to Rome's doorstep. The journey ahead would cost him dearly, but the fire that had been lit beneath that ancient altar would burn until the end. Hannibal Barca had begun his march not just across mountains, but into history. In the autumn of 218 BCE, as cold winds swept across the valleys of the Rhone and mist clung to the high passes of the Alps, a force unlike any the ancient world had ever seen began to move. It was not simply an army. It was a declaration, a message written in the footprints of men, horses, and elephants that carved a path from the western edge of the Mediterranean Strait into the heart of Italy. At its head marched a man whose very name would come to haunt the dreams of Roman children for generations, Hannibal Barca. With the fall of Saguntum behind him and the fires of war rekindled, Hannibal wasted no time. He gathered his forces in Cartagena. Tens of thousands of infantry, fierce Numidian cavalry, veteran Iberian warriors hardened in the hills of Hispania, and a dozen massive war elephants. This was no static defense. Hannibal's war would be one of motion, surprise, and relentless pressure. He would not defend Carthage's borders. He would not wait for Rome to come. He would carry the war to them. But his plan was nothing short of suicidal in the eyes of others. The only way to reach Italy without confronting Rome's navy was overland, north across Gaul, then across the towering, treacherous Alps. It was a journey of thousands of kilometers, over terrain that defied logistics, threatened death at every turn, and promised no guarantees. The Alps had broken armies before. The mountains did not care for strategy. They swallowed men whole and shattered dreams like twigs. Still, Hannibal moved, crossing the Ebro River. He left behind garrisons to secure Carthaginian holdings in Hispania and began the long march north. He was not just marching against Rome. He was marching against history itself. And he did so with a calm, burning certainty that only those possessed by purpose can understand. As his forces advanced into Gaul, local tribes rose to resist. Rome had long influenced the region and saw it as a buffer. But Hannibal, ever the tactician, did not fight every battle. He negotiated, manipulated, bribed, and when necessary, destroyed. His reputation preceded him. Tales of the siege of Saguntum spread like wildfire, and fear opened many gates. Reaching the Rhone River posed a significant challenge. Roman forces, under Publius Cornelius Scipio, had just landed in Massilia, modern-day Marseille, believing they would intercept Hannibal in southern Gaul. But Hannibal was already ahead of them, moving faster than anyone expected. At the Rhone, he executed one of his most daring maneuvers, sending a detachment upriver to cross secretly and outflank the Gallic opposition, forcing a retreat without full engagement. With the Rhone behind him, the real test began. The Alps. In all of human history until that point, no army of Hannibal's size had attempted such a feat. The mountains stood like a wall against his ambition, steep, snow-covered, riddled with narrow passes and tribes hostile to foreign invaders. Hannibal's soldiers, many from sun-soaked Iberia and the warm plains of Africa, looked up at the icy peaks with dread. Some deserted. Others froze. Yet Hannibal pressed on. It took more than 2 weeks to cross. The weather was brutal. Food was scarce. Pack animals fell to their deaths. Slippery paths turned to deadly slides. Avalanches buried men alive. Hostile mountain tribes ambushed supply lines. At one point, Hannibal's army had to carve a path through a landslide with fire and vinegar to break rock. He lost thousands of soldiers in that crossing. Nearly half of the elephants perished. But the survivors, those who endured, emerged on the Italian side not as an army demoralized, but as an army reborn. They had crossed what many considered the end of the known world. And below them lay the rich plains of the Po Valley. Rome had not expected this. They believed Hannibal would remain in Hispania or be stopped by the Alps. Now, a foreign army stood on their soil, hardened by fire and frost, led by a commander who had just done the impossible. The tribes of northern Italy, long subjugated by Rome, began to stir. Some defected. Others offered quiet support. Hannibal wasted no time and struck south, encountering the Roman army at the Battle of the Ticinus River. Here, Hannibal's cavalry, light, fast, and expertly commanded, crushed the Roman horsemen and wounded the consul Publius Scipio, father of the man who would one day become Hannibal's greatest rival. Then came the Battle of the Trebia. It was winter. Snow dusted the ground. The Romans, now under the command of Tiberius Sempronius Longus, believed Hannibal would be too weakened from the Alps to fight. They thought him desperate. They were wrong. Hannibal lured them into a trap, allowing the Romans to ford the icy Trebia River at dawn, soaking them to the bone, before unleashing a devastating assault from all sides. Hidden forces emerged from ambush, encircling the Roman legions. What began as a confident engagement turned into a slaughter. Thousands of Romans died and Hannibal stood victorious again. With every victory his legend grew. But Hannibal understood something deeper. Fear was now his weapon. The mere rumor of his presence could shake cities. Mothers in Rome whispered his name to frighten their children. The Senate convened in panic. Hannibal was not just a general. He had become a shadow and omen. Still, he advanced. In 217 BCE, he orchestrated another brilliant maneuver. He lured the Roman consul Gaius Flaminius into pursuit and ambushed him at Lake Trasimene. As thick morning fog blanketed the hills, Hannibal's forces emerged from concealed positions and struck with terrifying precision. The lake trapped the Romans on one side, and Hannibal's men pressed in. Flaminius was killed. His army was annihilated. It remains one of the largest and most successful ambushes in military history. Rome, stunned by these repeated disasters, turned to a new strategy: delay. They appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, who adopted a policy of attrition, avoiding direct battle with Hannibal, instead shadowing him, cutting off supplies, and wearing him down. It was the strategy of time and patience, a war of erosion. But Hannibal, though frustrated, did not stop. He moved through the Italian countryside, untouched, raiding, recruiting, and trying to persuade Rome's allies to defect. Some did. Others feared Roman retribution more than Carthaginian promises. Still, he persisted. By now, Hannibal had marched across an entire continent. He had crossed mountains no one dared cross, defeated armies in their own heartland, and proved again and again that Rome was vulnerable. Yet Rome did not fall. Its walls held. Its spirit, though shaken, did not break. Hannibal had expected that his victories would fracture the Roman alliance system. But Rome's grip on its allies proved stronger than anticipated. He had won battles, but not yet the war. Still, he was not done. The next confrontation, just a year away, would become one of the greatest tactical masterpieces ever recorded in human history. And in that moment, with Italy beneath his boots and Rome within reach, Hannibal Barca, a warrior of Carthage, son of vengeance, master of the impossible, prepared for a battle that would echo for millennia. By the summer of 216 BCE, Rome had bled enough. In less than 2 years, its armies had been shattered in the Po Valley, annihilated at the Trebia River, ambushed at Lake Trasimene. Consuls had died. Legions had vanished. The Senate had buried sons and fathers alike. And through it all, one name remained unyielding, a specter whose presence turned victory into ritual and defeat into devastation. Hannibal. Yet Rome still stood. Despite the horror that gripped the Republic, it refused to surrender. Rome was built not only on legions, but on a philosophy unyielding, cold, and ancient. It could tolerate disaster, it could absorb terror, but it could not accept dishonor. So the Romans resolved not merely to resist Hannibal, but to crush him. They would not wait. They would not delay. They would meet him with numbers, fury, and resolve. In the hot plains of Apulia, near a small town called Cannae, they gathered their answer. It was the largest army Rome had ever assembled. Nearly 90,000 men. 2 consuls led them. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a veteran of nobility and caution, and Gaius Terentius Varro, a populist eager for glory and revenge. Though the Roman constitution dictated that command alternate daily between consuls, their ambition was unified by one shared goal: destroy Hannibal. Hannibal, ever the strategist, had chosen the battlefield himself. The plain near Cannae offered space, wide, flat, open. On such terrain, Roman numbers could become overwhelming. But he had learned Rome's rhythm, its reliance on brute strength and frontal assault. He had studied it like one studies the beating of a drum, predictable, thunderous, and ultimately vulnerable. He placed his army with deliberate care. His own forces numbered fewer, perhaps 50,000 men. Yet they were a symphony of cohesion and experience. Iberians and Gauls formed the center. On the flanks, Libyan heavy infantry stood in silence, shields polished, blades sharpened. Behind them, cavalry, swift, deadly Numidians and veteran Iberian horsemen, waited like coiled serpents in the grass. The morning of the battle was thick with dust and wind. The Roman army, arranged in deep formation, sought to break through the Carthaginian center with sheer mass, focusing their weight, their will, into a single crushing blow. And Hannibal gave them what they wanted. He placed his center line slightly forward, creating the illusion of vulnerability. The Iberians and Gauls were instructed to yield slowly, to absorb, bend, retreat without breaking. As the Romans surged forward, they poured into this crescent of retreat, convinced they were pushing Hannibal's army toward collapse. But the collapse was not real. It was a trap. At the critical moment, when the Roman legions were deep in the center and their flanks exposed, the Libyan infantry on both sides pivoted inward. Like closing jaws, they struck the Roman sides, cutting off lateral movement. At the same time, Hannibal's cavalry, having routed the Roman horsemen, wheeled around and attacked from the rear. The Roman army, so vast, so certain, found itself encircled. In minutes, the formation became a prison. No space to maneuver, no room to escape. Swords clashed in such tight proximity that many could not lift their arms to fight. Men were suffocated by the press of bodies, trampled by allies, driven mad by panic. It was slaughter, not battle. The sun rose high and fell toward evening, and still the killing did not cease. Romans died not by the hundreds but by the thousands. Estimates vary, some claim 50,000 fell, others say 70,000. It is possible more Roman citizens died in a single day at Cannae than in any other battle in the Republic's history. When night finally covered the blood-soaked plain, silence returned. It was not victory that stood there, it was something older, something darker. Hannibal had not just defeated a Roman army, he had butchered its soul. And yet Rome still did not fall. This was the enigma Hannibal would never fully conquer. No matter how crushing the blow, the Republic did not fracture. Allies remained loyal. New legions were raised. Roads were repaired. Temples burned incense to forgotten gods. Rome endured, not because of its strength, but because of its sheer, unyielding belief in itself. Hannibal, victorious beyond imagination, stood at the gates of history. Yet he did not march on Rome. Why? Theories abound. His army, though triumphant, was exhausted. His supply lines stretched thin. His siege equipment was minimal. And Carthage, his homeland, did not send reinforcements. They feared his growing power. They feared the cost. Instead, Hannibal turned south toward Capua, toward diplomacy, toward alliances. He sought to peel away the layers of Roman loyalty, hoping that one great battle would cause the Republic to unravel. But Rome, wounded and staggering, wrapped its bleeding hands around its sword and held on. It declared a new strategy. No longer would it meet Hannibal in pitched battle. It would shadow him, exhaust him, isolate him. It was the birth of Fabian tactics, named after Quintus Fabius Maximus, the dictator who preached delay, attrition, and time as the weapons Rome still possessed. And it worked. Over the next years, Hannibal won battles but not allies. The Italian cities remained hesitant. Rome's grip, though weakened, did not break. And the Senate, now hardened by pain, resolved to outlive its tormentor. Still, Hannibal lingered. In Capua, in southern Italy, he rested, rebuilt, and waited. His name was still a curse in Rome, still whispered in the forum, still feared in the countryside. But time, always silent, always slow, was beginning to turn against him. Cannae was his zenith. It was the battle that every military commander in every century would study. It was the moment Hannibal became immortal. But victory, as history often shows, is not always enough. He had cracked Rome's armor, but he had not broken its will. And in the shadows of that truth, the ghost of Hannibal began to drift. After Cannae, silence fell across Italy like a veil of ash. The fields were soaked with Roman blood, and the smoke of defeat lingered not only in the plains of Apulia, but in the very soul of the Republic. And yet, the city on the Tiber did not fall. It clenched its jaw, rebuilt its walls, and lit torches for the dead. Hannibal had delivered the most decisive blow ever struck against Rome, but he had not crushed it. Rome would not die easily, and Hannibal, for all his brilliance, would now find himself in a place far more brutal than the battlefield, the long, slow grind of a war with no end. For the next 14 years, Hannibal remained in Italy, a foreign commander on hostile soil, roaming a country that he had once hoped would welcome him as a liberator. He campaigned with relentless energy, moving through Apulia, Campania, Lucania, and Bruttium. He raided, negotiated, and besieged. He appealed to the Latin allies of Rome to rise in revolt. He offered them gold, protection, and vengeance. A few cities defected. Most did not. He made Capua his base, a wealthy city that believed Rome's grip was weakening. For a time, Capua flourished under Hannibal's shadow. But Rome, furious, sent legions not against Hannibal directly, but against Capua itself. It was not the general they feared, it was the idea that others might follow him. Capua resisted, then fell. Its leaders were executed, its walls torn down. The message was clear: Rome would punish not just the enemy but the thought of rebellion. Hannibal was now a master without a stage. He had shown the world genius at Trebia, audacity in the Alps, and perfection at Cannae. But what he faced now was not a battlefield, it was time itself. Rome no longer chased him. It shadowed him. Avoided pitched battle denied him the opportunity to strike again. The Romans had turned to the policy of Fabius Maximus: delay, attrition, starvation. In the hills and valleys of southern Italy, Hannibal's army moved like smoke. He won skirmishes. He ambushed supply lines. He trained new recruits. But each victory brought no change. Rome adapted. The Senate poured money into legions, into roads, into spies. They monitored his every move. And slowly, methodically, they cut off his lifelines. Carthage, once proud of its favorite son, now grew cautious. Some in the ruling council feared Hannibal's rising fame. Others feared Rome's retaliation. They sent only meager reinforcements. Hannibal wrote letters. He pleaded. But Carthage had moved on. Isolation crept into Hannibal's war. His allies thinned. His horses aged. His elephants, once a symbol of invincibility, were gone. Supply lines were fragile. His veterans, hardened by years of fighting, began to die, not in battle, but of hunger, of disease, of time. And always Rome stood just beyond reach. It would not engage. It would not risk another Cannae. In 211 BCE, Hannibal did the unthinkable. He marched to the very gates of Rome. It was not an invasion, but a statement, a symbolic gesture of defiance. He stood within sight of the walls, taunting a city that still refused to break. But Rome did not panic. The Senate did not flee. The citizens did not run. They fortified. They endured. And Hannibal, lacking siege equipment, lacking numbers, lacking time, turned away. It was perhaps the bitterest moment of his life. As the years passed, Hannibal became a shadow. Still feared, still unmatched, but slowly fading from the center of the war. Rome turned its attention elsewhere. In Hispania, a new commander had risen, Publius Cornelius Scipio. The son of the man Hannibal had wounded at the Ticinus River. Scipio was young, bold, and intelligent. He studied Hannibal's campaigns not to admire them, but to defeat them. By 209 BCE, Scipio had retaken most of Iberia. The territory that had once been Hannibal's stronghold now slipped from Carthaginian hands. Rome had learned to fight not by brute strength, but with strategy, and Scipio was its future. Hannibal, meanwhile, was running out of options. In 207 BCE, his brother Hasdrubal, commander of the remaining Carthaginian forces in Iberia, marched to join Hannibal in Italy, bringing reinforcements. But Rome, aware of the danger, intercepted him at the Metaurus River. In a brutal engagement, Hasdrubal's army was destroyed. The general was killed. His head, severed, was thrown into Hannibal's camp as a message. It was more than a death. It was a tombstone for Hannibal's dream. He had entered Italy with fire in his eyes, with the legacy of his father behind him, and with the weight of Carthage at his back. But now he stood alone. No reinforcements, no family, no way forward. And yet he did not surrender. Even in decline, Hannibal remained a master of maneuver. He adapted to Roman tactics. He avoided traps. He trained his remaining forces with the discipline of survival. He became a creature of the terrain, emerging, striking, vanishing. Rome could not destroy him, but it no longer feared him as it once did. In the Senate, debates turned from dread to calculation. Hannibal was no longer an existential threat, he was a problem to be managed. He lingered in the southern tip of Italy, Bruttium, where the land was harsh and the people wary. His army, once numbering tens of thousands, had dwindled. His officers, once confident and ambitious, now fought for scraps and memory. He had been in Italy longer than some Romans had been alive. And then word came from Carthage. Scipio had invaded Africa. Rome had reversed the war. It no longer defended, it attacked. The hunter had become the hunted. Carthage, desperate, called Hannibal home. In 203 BCE, after 16 years on enemy soil, Hannibal Barca boarded a ship and sailed back to the city of his birth. He left behind the land he had invaded, haunted, and bled into history. He left behind the dream of a Rome undone by genius alone. Italy had become a graveyard of opportunity. He had not been defeated, but he had not triumphed. What awaited him at home was a final reckoning. But even as the winds pushed his ship across the sea, Hannibal knew the war was not over. There was still one battle left. In the year 203 BCE, Hannibal Barca returned to Carthage, not as the victorious conqueror he had once envisioned, but as a general summoned in desperation. The city that had sent him to war with hesitant support now begged for his leadership. Roman legions, led by the rising star Scipio Africanus, had crossed the sea and were laying siege to Carthaginian soil. For the first time in the war, the enemy stood not in Italy, but at the very doorstep of Carthage itself. The war had come full circle. 16 years earlier, Hannibal had departed for Italy with fire and certainty. He returned with scars, with silence, and with the knowledge that the tide of history had shifted. Yet even now, he did not waver. The Senate restored him to full command. He raised an army, whatever forces could be mustered. Veterans from Bruttium who had followed him across 2 decades. Levies scraped from the hinterlands, cavalry from Numidian allies whose loyalty was now fragile. And he prepared to face an enemy unlike any he had ever met. Scipio Africanus was not an ordinary Roman. He had studied Hannibal's campaigns, mimicked his strategies, and evolved Rome's military doctrine around them. He was not driven by vengeance, but by vision, a Rome that would rise beyond the Italian peninsula, that would dominate the Mediterranean as Carthage once had. Young, charismatic, and lethal in command, Scipio had come not just to end the war, but to eclipse his enemy. The 2 greatest generals of their age now stood across from one another, not in ambush, not in pursuit, but face to face, across a plain called Zama. It was a landscape of red dust and hard earth, broken only by patches of scrub and the restless hooves of war elephants. Here, in northern Africa, under a pale sky, the fate of 2 empires would be decided in a single day. Hannibal's army outnumbered Rome's. He had war elephants, a tool he had not used at Cannae. He arranged them at the front of his lines, hoping their charge would break Scipio's formations early. Behind them, he placed his less reliable levies, then his more experienced Carthaginian and Iberian infantry, and finally his veterans, the survivors of the Italian campaign, held in reserve. Scipio, disciplined and prepared, responded with adaptability. He ordered his legions to form open lanes between cohorts wide enough for the elephants to pass through without crushing his lines. When the elephants charged, Roman trumpeters blew in discordant waves, frightening and disorienting the beasts. Some turned back, trampling their own men. Others were channeled harmlessly down the corridors Scipio had prepared. The initial shock had failed. Then came the infantry engagement. Hannibal's first 2 lines advanced, pressing into the Roman front. The battle was fierce, grinding, and without elegance. 2 walls of flesh and steel locked in violent collision. But Hannibal had placed these lines not to win the battle, but to wear down the Roman core. His true hope lay in his 3rd line, the veterans. These were the men who had crossed the Alps with him, who had survived Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. They were not just soldiers. They were the very embodiment of his legacy. As the first lines faltered, the veterans stepped forward. But something was different now. The Roman army no longer crumbled under Carthaginian tactics. It held. It responded. Scipio, observing Hannibal's methods, had mirrored his flexibility. He extended his wings, rotated fresh troops to the front, and began to encircle the Carthaginian center. At the same time, Scipio's cavalry, commanded by the Numidian prince Massinissa, a former Carthaginian ally who had defected, returned from a sweeping maneuver around the battlefield. They struck the Carthaginian rear, collapsing the line from behind. It was the very tactic Hannibal had used at Cannae. Now it was turned against him. For the first time in the war, Hannibal's army was truly broken. The red dust of Zama swallowed the last cries of the wounded. The field that had once offered Hannibal a final chance became a graveyard of dreams. The war elephants lay scattered, the veterans dead or captured, the Numidian cavalry riding triumphant. Scipio stood victorious. Hannibal did not fall in battle. He survived. He gathered what remained of his force and returned to Carthage. There, he advised the Senate to accept peace. Rome imposed harsh terms. Carthage would surrender its navy, pay massive reparations, and never again wage war without Rome's consent. The Second Punic War was over. For Hannibal, it was not merely the end of a campaign, it was the end of an era. The man who had once stood at the gates of Rome now watched his city bow before it. He had shaped history, defied odds, and humbled a superpower, but he had not prevailed. And yet, even in defeat, Hannibal retained the respect of his enemies. Scipio, who might have demanded Hannibal's death, allowed him to live. Some say the two men even met face to face after the battle, exchanging words that history could only dream of recording. Carthage survived, but it was no longer Carthage. It became a client state, its ambitions caged, its future rewritten. Rome rose, fueled by the crucible of its near destruction, and began its transformation from republic to empire. And Hannibal? He turned from the battlefield to the realm of politics. But the shadows of Rome followed him still. When Hannibal returned from the ashes of Zama, he was not received as a traitor, nor was he embraced as a hero. Carthage stood on the edge of ruin, humbled, stripped, but not yet destroyed. Its people were weary of war, its coffers empty, its navy surrendered, its ambition shackled by Rome's terms. But they still had Hannibal, and that name, even in defeat, still carried the weight of myth. The Senate appointed him Suffic, chief magistrate. It was a title that once carried little more than ceremonial dignity, but in Hannibal's hands, it became a tool of reform. He turned from war to reconstruction, directing his energy toward reviving Carthage's broken body. The city had been bled dry by years of tribute and corruption, and Hannibal now fought a different kind of war, against the rot within. He attacked graft. He restructured taxes. He introduced public audits. He dismantled aristocratic monopolies. The merchant elite, many of whom had grown rich while Carthage bled in Italy, resisted him. But Hannibal was relentless. He believed that if Carthage could not defeat Rome in war, it might still rise again through discipline, order, and economic strength. And for a time it worked. Trade returned. Debt fell. Confidence grew. Carthage breathed again. But Rome never forgot. The very name Hannibal still echoed in the Roman psyche like a half-remembered nightmare. To Roman senators, he was not simply a general. They saw him as a force, a symbol of humiliation that must not be allowed to grow again. When Carthage began to stabilize, whispers reached Rome. They feared Hannibal might one day lead Carthage into rebellion. And so, through political pressure and veiled threats, Rome demanded his removal. Faced with the certainty of assassination or betrayal, Hannibal chose exile. He left his homeland, not in chains, but in silence. Thus began the final chapter of his life, not as a commander of legions, but as a man without a country, drifting from court to court, offering his knowledge, his cunning, and his unbroken will to anyone who might stand against Rome. He first sought refuge with Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire in the east. The king, ambitious and wary of Rome's rising dominance, welcomed him. Hannibal advised on military tactics, naval construction, and diplomatic strategy. But he quickly learned that even among Rome's enemies, few possessed his clarity of purpose. Antiochus, despite his might, hesitated. He delayed, and in the end he lost. Rome struck swiftly and decisively. In the Treaty of Apamea, one of the terms demanded by Rome was the surrender of Hannibal. He fled again. From city to city, kingdom to kingdom, he moved like a phantom, from Tyre to Crete, from Armenia to Bithynia. Each ruler who harbored him feared the long shadow of Rome. Hannibal was still revered, still sought as a military genius, but no throne dared defy the Republic long enough to keep him. He became hunted. The hunter of Rome, the master of ambushes. The architect of Cannae now lived under false names in guarded villas with secret paths to the sea. Yet even in exile he remained sharp. He wrote treatises on war. He corresponded with generals. He advised minor kings on matters of tactics and discipline. His mind, always active, refused to rust. But time had other plans. He was now in his 60s and the world around him had changed. Rome, once battered and bleeding, had become a giant. The Republic now ruled Iberia, Greece, parts of Asia Minor. Its consuls no longer feared Hannibal's sword, but they feared his legacy. The final attempt came in Bithynia, where Hannibal had taken sanctuary under King Prusias. Rome, persistent as ever, sent envoys demanding his surrender. Prusias, under pressure, began to bend. The net tightened. Hannibal saw it coming. He had always planned for this moment. He had kept a vial of poison with him for years, a final measure against capture. To fall into Roman hands was to be paraded through the streets, chained, humiliated, turned into a symbol of submission. Hannibal would not grant them that satisfaction. He chose his moment. In a small coastal village, surrounded by Roman agents and deserted by allies, he drank the poison. The man who had marched across the Alps, who had slaughtered legions, who had humbled the greatest republic in the ancient world, died not on a battlefield but in silence. Some say his last words were a curse. Others say they were a farewell. No one truly knows. But history remembers. Rome may have defeated Carthage. It may have erased its power, its fleet, its territory. But it could never erase Hannibal. His name endured in military academies, in strategic texts, in the whispers of those who admired brilliance even in defeat. He had lived a life guided by an oath, spoken as a child at his father's side, on an altar of fire. That oath had driven him across continents, through victory and loss, across triumph and exile. He had kept it until the very end, not as a citizen, not as a general, but as Hannibal. When Hannibal Barca closed his eyes for the final time in the distant province of Bithynia, no trumpets sounded. No soldiers stood in formation. No banners bore his name. The man who had once shaken the foundations of the Roman Republic died not in battle, not in rebellion, but alone, surrounded by fear, silence, and the fading scent of exile. Yet even as his breath vanished, the world felt the echo. It was the end of a man, but the beginning of a legend. History is often written by victors, and Rome, in its relentless rise, had every reason to bury the memory of its greatest enemy. But it could not, for Hannibal's story was too large to erase, too complex to simplify, and too brilliant to ignore. Even Rome, proud and merciless, could not help but admire what it had once feared. In the Senate decades later, Roman statesmen still spoke of Hannibal in reverent tones, sometimes as a threat, sometimes as a model, always as a shadow. Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated him, is said to have ranked Hannibal among the greatest generals who had ever lived, alongside Alexander the Great and Pyrrhus of Epirus. There was no tomb for Hannibal, no shrine, no marble statue, no inscription carved into the earth where his bones rested. And yet, he became immortal. He lived on in the minds of commanders who would study his tactics for centuries to come. Napoleon Bonaparte, surveying a map of Italy, paused over Cannae and whispered of Hannibal's genius. Owen Rommel, the desert fox of World War II, carried volumes on Hannibal's maneuvers, replicating his flanking techniques in North Africa. American generals in modern military academies still dissect his decisions, learning how to win through mobility, deception, and timing. But Hannibal's legacy is more than military brilliance. It is the story of will against inevitability, a tale not of perfect triumph but of glorious defiance. He was born in the aftermath of defeat, raised in the shadow of humiliation. From childhood, he was forged not by comfort but by purpose. While others played, he prepared. While others obeyed, he dreamed. And when the time came, he did not hesitate. He crossed the Alps not because it was possible, but because no one believed it was. He stood in Italy for 16 years not because he expected victory each day, but because surrender was not an option. He survived the loss of allies, of family, of homeland, not to seek comfort, but to preserve dignity. Hannibal's war was never just against Rome. It was against fate, against history's tide, against the towering inertia of an empire rising. And perhaps that is why his story resonates still. Because every age has its empires. Every age has its Romes. And in every age, there are those who stand against them, not to conquer, but to prove that greatness is not measured only in success, but in how one resists defeat. Even his end, a sip of poison in a forgotten town, was not surrender. It was refusal. Refusal to be paraded through the streets of Rome like a trophy. Refusal to let his captors write the final line of his story. He chose instead to vanish on his own terms. A soldier, a strategist, a statesman, a wanderer. Hannibal was all of these and none. He never ruled an empire. He never built monuments. He never held the Senate, the Forum, or the Temple. But he held the attention of Rome for decades. And he still holds the imagination of the world. The last enemy he faced was not Scipio. Not the Roman army. Not the shifting alliances of kings and courts. The last enemy was time. And time in the end could not defeat him. Because Hannibal Barca, born of Carthage, lives wherever there are those who stand, eyes unwavering, before the impossible, and choose to march forward,